The echo was the last part of him to die. It wasn't the echo of his voice or his laugh or the gentle promises he'd whispered to her under a Pennsylvania moon. It was the echo of the gunshot that had ripped through their small cabin, a sound so total and absolute it had become the new silence. Now that echo was gone, swallowed by the ceaseless Montana wind that shrieked through the splintered wood of the doorframe. Alara Vance, 17 years old, sat on the cold floor, her back pressed against the rough-hewn logs of the wall. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the splinters digging into her thin calico dress. She only felt the feather-light weight of the swaddled bundle in her arms, a life so new it had not yet learned the concept of an ending. Her daughter, Lily. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the other side of the single room. Her husband, Daniel, lay sprawled near the stone hearth where a fire he had built just hours ago now sputtered and died. The crimson stain on his chest was a ghastly blossoming flower on the faded plaid of his shirt, dark and wet in the dim light. The metallic, coppery smell of it mixed with the acrid scent of spent gunpowder, a perfume of pure horror. She should have been screaming. A part of her, a distant, logical part that still remembered the girl she was yesterday, knew that. But the scream was a block of ice in her throat. Her entire being had collapsed inward, a supernova of shock, leaving behind only one burning, singular point of focus: the quiet breaths of the baby in her lap. "Don't cry, please, Lily, don't make a sound." The men had ridden off, their hoofbeats fading into the wind's lament, but fear was a creature that lingered long after its masters had gone. The night passed in that frozen tableau. Alara did not move, did not sleep. She just sat, a statue of grief, guarding her child from a world that had, in the space of a single heartbeat, revealed its true monstrous face. When the first weak, gray light of dawn bled through the broken door, it brought with it a cold that finally pierced her shock. It was a physical, biting cold that made her teeth chatter and Lily stir with a soft, whimpering cry. That sound, that tiny plea for life, broke the spell. The scream she'd held back all night finally tore from her lungs, but it was silent, a ragged, airless gasp that racked her small frame. Grief, raw and savage, flooded in. But on its heels came something else, something hard and sharp. Resolve. Daniel was gone, but Lily was here, and this land, this cruel, beautiful, terrible land, was theirs. He had died for it. With a strength she did not know she possessed, Alara rose on trembling legs. She laid Lily gently in her makeshift crib, a wooden crate lined with a soft blanket. She found Daniel's spare flannel shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders, the faint scent of him, of pine and sweat and hope, a fresh stab to her heart. Then she took up the small spade they used for the garden. The ground outside was like iron, locked in the grip of an early, vicious winter. Every scrape of the metal spade against the frozen earth sent a jarring shock up her arms. Her hands, soft and unused to such labor, blistered, then broke open and bled. She didn't stop. She dug, her tears freezing on her cheeks, her breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a shallow, pathetic grave, but it was all she could give him. She dragged his body, wrapped in their best quilt, out into the biting wind. It felt impossibly heavy, as if all his lost dreams had settled in his bones. As she gently rolled him into the earth, her mind flashed back to the journey west, Daniel's face alight with talk of building a future, a legacy. "It's not just land, Alara," he'd said, his eyes as wide as the sky. "It's a kingdom for our children." She covered him with the frozen dirt, her movements mechanical. Patting down the last of the soil with the back of the spade, she sank to her knees, the fight draining out of her. She whispered a few broken lines of the 23rd Psalm, her voice a raw croak. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." She couldn't finish. This wasn't a shadow. It was the thing itself. The valley was real, and she was in it, utterly and completely alone. 2 days later, a rider approached. Alara saw him from the cabin window, a stately figure on a magnificent black horse, moving with an unnerving smoothness across the rugged terrain. He was not the kind of man who belonged here, amidst the dirt and struggle. He was dressed in a fine, dark coat with a velvet collar, his hat clean, his boots polished to a high sheen. As he drew closer, she recognized him from their one trip into the nearby town of Redemption Gap. Silas Kane, the man who owned the bank, the saloon, and, it was said, the soul of the town itself. He dismounted with a practiced grace, his spurs jingling like funeral bells. He swept his hat from his head, revealing a mane of silver hair. His face was handsome in a severe way, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter sky. "Mrs. Vanna," he said, his voice a rich, sympathetic baritone that didn't reach his eyes. "I only just heard of the terrible tragedy. My deepest, most sincere condolences." Alara stood on her small porch, Lily bundled against her chest, Daniel's heavy rifle clutched in her right hand. She didn't know how to use it, but she knew what it represented. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice flat. "Your husband was a fool to think he could tame this land," Silas said, his sympathetic tone already fraying at the edges. "It chews up men with pretty dreams and spits them out. This is no place for you, my dear. Certainly no place for a child." "He was a dreamer," she repeated, the words feeling like a flimsy shield. Silas stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Dreams turn to dust out here. I knew Daniel. He came to my bank before he bought this claim. I warned him, this valley, it has a reputation." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "I'm a charitable man, Mrs. Vance. I'd be willing to take this unfortunate plot off your hands. For a modest sum, of course, enough for a ticket back east where you belong. You can forget this nightmare ever happened." The offer was so blatant, so predatory, it cut through her grief like a shard of glass. He was a vulture, circling before the body was even cold. She clutched the rifle tighter. In her pocket, her fingers found the folded, precious paper of the deed to the property, the one Daniel had registered in both their names. "This is my home now," she said, her voice low but clear. "My husband died for this land. I'm not leaving." For a fraction of a second, the charming facade of Silas Kane dissolved. His eyes went flat and cold, full of a chilling possessiveness. Then just as quickly he smiled, a tight, humorless expression that did not touch his eyes. "A spirited woman. I admire that," he said, the words a veiled threat. "We'll see how long that sentiment lasts when the winter bites, Mrs. Vance. It has very sharp teeth." He turned, mounted his horse with that same liquid grace, and rode away, leaving behind a silence more menacing than the wind. Alara watched him go, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. She had just met the man who had ordered her husband's death. She didn't know how she knew, but the certainty of it settled into her bones like the winter chill. The next day, she bundled Lily tightly and made the arduous 5-mile trek to Redemption Gap. The town was a line of dusty, false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth. It was a town built on Silas Kane's money, and it felt like it. The sheriff's office was a small, bleak room that smelled of stale tobacco and apathy. Sheriff Brody was a man gone to seed, with a gut that spilled over his gun belt and eyes that held a permanent, weary disinterest. He listened to Alara's story, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall behind her head. He didn't write a single word down. "Claim jumpers, most likely," he said with a sigh when she'd finished, his voice heavy with boredom. "A bad business. They're long gone by now, ma'am. Miles away. Nothing I can do." "But I think," she started, her voice trembling. "I think it was Silas Kane." Brody's head snapped up. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear. "You watch your mouth, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Silas Kane is the man who built this town. He's a pillar of this community. You're grieving, that's all. Seeing shadows where there ain't none." He stood up, a clear dismissal. "Go on home, Mrs. Vance. There's no crime to solve here, just a tragedy." Alara walked out of the office, the door closing behind her with a soft click of finality. The law was a lie. Justice was a word for people in another place, another world. Here, there was only Kane's law. She looked down the dusty street, at the faces of the people who hurried past, their eyes averted. They knew. They all knew. And they were all afraid. She was completely, utterly on her own. From a rocky outcrop half a mile away, hidden in a thicket of stunted pines, a pair of eyes watched the small cabin. They were dark, patient eyes, set in a face the color of weathered copper. Chayton had been tracking a mountain lion for 2 days when the sound of gunshots had echoed up the valley. He had seen the riders flee from the cabin, their faces obscured by the distance and the dusk. He had seen the young woman, barely more than a girl, digging a grave the next morning, with a fury that spoke of more than just grief. He had seen Silas Kane's visit, recognizing the man's arrogant posture even from afar. He knew Kane. All the displaced people knew Kane, and men like him. They were the reason his own family was no longer in the green hills of Mississippi, the reason his tongue still remembered the Choctaw words for home, a place he had never seen. He watched the woman make her futile journey to town and saw the slump in her shoulders when she returned. He saw her struggle. He watched her try to mend the splintered door with clumsy, inadequate tools. He saw her try to hunt for squirrels with the loud, heavy pistol, the sound of her misses echoing in the quiet valley. He saw the light in her cabin burn lower and lower each night as her supply of oil dwindled. He saw her growing thinner, her face etched with a desperation that was painful to witness. She was a ghost haunting her own life, and the land was waiting to claim her. Days turned into a week. The cold deepened. A hard snow fell, blanketing the valley in a pristine, merciless white. Alara's meager supply of salted pork and dried beans shrank with alarming speed. Lily's cries became thinner, weaker. The gnawing fear of starvation was a constant physical ache in Alara's belly. One morning, she awoke to a new horror. She went to the small, lean-to shelter where she kept her last provisions, a small sack of flour and the last of the salted meat. They were gone. In the snow were the distinct tracks of a scavenging coyote, bold enough to come right up to the cabin. That was the breaking point. The last thread of her composure snapped. She stumbled back into the cabin, sank to the floor, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she allowed herself to truly weep. It was a storm of grief, of terror, of utter, hopeless despair. She cried for her lost husband, for her hungry child, for the foolish girl from Pennsylvania who thought she could conquer the world. She cried until she was empty, a hollowed-out shell. It was over. Kane had won without lifting another finger. The winter had done his work for him. She must have dozed, an exhausted sleep of pure defeat. When she awoke, the light had changed, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Lily was stirring, her small whimpers beginning again. With a sigh that felt like it was tearing her soul from her body, Alara pushed herself to her feet to face the broken door. And there, on the rough plank of her doorstep, lay a rabbit. It was freshly killed, its body still limp and warm, a single, neat puncture wound in its neck. There was no blood on the snow, and more strangely, there were no footprints. None but her own from the day before, now blurred by the wind. It was as if the rabbit had simply materialized out of thin air. Alara stared, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. It was impossible. It was a miracle. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the silent, snow-covered ridges that surrounded her small, lonely valley. For the first time in a long time, the oppressive silence didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching. A flicker of something she couldn't name, not quite hope, but a deep, unnerving curiosity, pierced through the fog of her despair. She wasn't alone. The rabbit was not a one-time occurrence. 2 days later, she found a brace of plump quail lying in the same spot, their feathers still iridescent in the morning light. The day after that, a small pile of earthy, gnarled roots she didn't recognize were left on the stump where she chopped firewood. Fear warred with a desperate, burgeoning gratitude. Her benefactor was a ghost, a silent, invisible presence who moved without leaving a trace. She knew it was no spirit. This was a man of flesh and blood, a hunter of impossible skill. But was he friend or foe? Why help her? Why remain hidden? She decided to answer kindness with kindness. After skinning and cooking one of the quail, she left a small portion of the savory broth in a tin cup on the doorstep before she went to bed. The next morning, the cup was empty and clean, sitting precisely where she had left it. A silent communication had begun. A fragile thread of trust spun across a gulf of silence and fear. She started leaving other small tokens. a piece of wood she'd spent an hour carving into the shape of a bird, a strip of cloth torn from her own dwindling supply. Each was always gone by morning. The gifts of food never stopped. The first time she saw him was a week later. She had ventured farther from the cabin than usual, searching for fallen branches thick enough to provide a long burning fire. Lily was strapped to her back in a makeshift carrier, a warm, precious weight. Alara was so focused on her task, on the crunch of her boots in the snow, that she didn't hear the wolf until it was too late. It emerged from a stand of aspens, a gaunt, gray phantom with eyes of yellow ice. It was starving, made bold by hunger. It lowered its head, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Alara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rifle was back at the cabin. She was defenseless. All she could do was slowly, carefully, begin to back away, her body shielding the child on her back. The wolf took a step forward, then another, its lips peeling back from yellowed fangs. It tensed its haunches, preparing to spring. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, a prayer catching in her throat. A sound like a sharp sigh cut through the air. Thwump! The wolf yelped, a choked, surprised sound, and collapsed sideways into the snow, a feathered arrow shaft protruding from its neck. Alara's eyes flew open. From the deep shadows of the pines, a figure emerged. He was tall and lean, moving with a silent, fluid grace that seemed a part of the landscape itself. He was dressed in buckskins, his face framed by two long black braids. He held a bow in one hand. It was him. The ghost. He stopped 20 feet away, his expression unreadable. He looked at her, his dark eyes taking in her ragged dress, her frightened face, and then his gaze softened, almost imperceptibly as it rested on the baby carrier. "It was you," Alara stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. "The food." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and raspy, as if he wasn't used to using it. "This land has teeth," he said. "A mother and child should not be alone." He walked to the dead wolf and knelt, pulling a knife from a sheath on his belt. With practiced, efficient movements, he began to skin the animal. Alara watched, mesmerized and terrified. "The pelt will keep the child warm," he said without looking up. "The teeth are good medicine, a sign of strength." The interaction was brief, practical, and yet it felt more profound than any conversation she'd had in months. He was not a threat. He was a protector. He finished his work, rolling the thick pelt into a bundle and handing it to her. His fingers brushed hers, his skin warm despite the cold. Then, with another nod, he turned and melted back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Alara stood alone in the clearing, the wolf pelt in her arms, her heart still beating a frantic rhythm, but now for an entirely different reason. Chayton, as she would come to learn was his name, began to appear more regularly. He never approached the cabin directly, always maintaining a respectful distance as if honoring an unspoken boundary. He became her silent teacher. He didn't lecture. He taught by showing. He would leave a cluster of herbs on a rock, and when she approached, he would emerge from the trees, mime crushing them and applying them to a cut on his own arm, teaching her of their healing properties. He showed her how to distinguish the tracks of a deer from those of an elk, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, how to find the driest tinder even after a heavy snow. One afternoon, he gestured towards the rifle that was always propped near her door. "The bow is quiet," he said, his first full sentence to her in days. "The fire stick is loud. It calls trouble. But you must know how to make it speak for you." She was learning. Every day she felt a piece of the terrified Pennsylvania girl sloughing away, replaced by something harder, more resilient. She was a quick study, her mind sharp, her motivation absolute. Every lesson she mastered was another brick in the wall she was building around her daughter. Their fragile peace was shattered one afternoon. Chayton had led her to a sun-drenched southern slope where berry bushes, protected from the worst of the wind, still held some shriveled fruit. They were gone for only a few hours. When they returned to the valley, a foul chemical stench hit them from 100 yards away. Alara broke into a run, her heart seizing with dread. She reached the small stone-lined well Daniel had dug with such pride and looked down. The water, her only source of clean water, was murky and corrupt. A dead rabbit, its body bloated, floated on the surface, and the water was slick with the rainbow sheen of oil or some other poison. Rage, pure and undiluted, burned away her fear. This was Cain's work. It was a coward's attack, not aimed at her, but at her child. To kill by thirst was a cruelty beyond imagining. "He won't fight me," she seethed, her hands clenched into fists. "He tries to kill my baby with a poisoned well. He is a coward." Chayton stood beside her, his face a grim mask. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "He is a vulture," he added, his voice low and intense. "He waits for the weak to die. We will not be weak." He led her away from the cabin, deep into the woods, following a game trail that was nearly invisible to her untrained eye. After a 20-minute walk, they came to a small, hidden hollow surrounded by a ring of ancient cottonwoods. There, bubbling up from between two moss-covered stones, was a spring. The water was so clear it was almost invisible and cold enough to make her teeth ache. "My people knew of this place," he said quietly. "The water runs deep. It is always pure." As Alara knelt and drank the clean, life-giving water, she knew her fate was now inextricably tied to this quiet, watchful man. He was no longer just a benefactor. He was her lifeline. That night, they made a small, smokeless fire near the hidden spring. The cold was a living thing, but the small flames held it at bay. For the first time, Chayton sat with her as an equal, not as a distant teacher. The shared threat had broken down the final barriers between them. The silence was comfortable, companionable. Bolstered by the warmth and the security of his presence, Alara began to speak. She told him of her life back home, of green fields and church bells, of a life of gentle order that seemed like a fairy tale now. She spoke of Daniel, of his dreams and his kindness, her voice thick with unshed tears. When she was finished, her story hanging in the quiet air between them, Chayton began to speak. He didn't talk about himself, not at first. He told her a story his grandfather had told him, a story of a long, terrible walk. The Trail of Tears. He spoke of his people, the Choctaw, of their ancestral home in Mississippi, a land of rolling hills and warm rivers, a land stolen from them by men with paper and guns. He spoke of the concept of Shalombish, the spirit that resides within all living things, a tree, a river, a person. It was, he explained, the essence of a thing's will to live, its inner fire. "That first day," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, "when you buried your husband, I was on the ridge. I saw you fall. I thought you were broken. But then you stood up. You went back inside to your child. In that moment, I saw your Shalombish. It was like a bright fire in the snow. I could not let it be put out." Alara looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as an Indian, not as a savior, but as a man. A man who had suffered his own profound losses, who carried the ghost of a whole nation inside him. They were two lonely souls from different worlds, united by a shared grief and a stubborn refusal to be extinguished. A current passed between them, something deeper than gratitude or dependence. It was a spark of recognition, of understanding. In the heart of the unforgiving Montana wilderness, a fragile, impossible connection had taken root. The arrival of Silas Kane was as jarring as a gunshot in a library. He didn't come alone this time. He rode with Sheriff Brody and two of his hired thugs, a brutish, bearded man named Jed and a wiry, rat-faced man called Pike. They stopped a few yards from the cabin, their horses trampling the snow. Kane's face was a mask of cold fury. The pretense of sympathy was gone. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice like chipping ice, "your time is up." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a battle standard. "This is an eviction notice, legally filed and executed by the sheriff of this territory. Your husband, it seems, was not only a dreamer, but a poor businessman. He borrowed a substantial sum against this land. From me. Here is the note, his signature right there at the bottom. The debt is past due." Alara's blood ran cold. She snatched the paper, her eyes scanning the document. Daniel's name was there, but the signature was a clumsy, angular forgery, nothing like his elegant script. "This is a lie," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "His signature is forged. He never would have done this." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Looks legal to me, ma'am," he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. "Says right here, you have 48 hours to vacate the premises. It's the law." "The law?" Alara laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Your law?" As they prepared to leave, Jed, the brutish one, smirked and leaned down from his horse, spitting a thick wad of tobacco directly onto the small mound of earth that marked Daniel's grave. Something inside Alara snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was pure primal instinct. A white-hot rage washed over her, erasing all fear, all hesitation. With a cry that was more animal than human, she spun around, burst back into the cabin, and snatched Daniel's heavy Winchester rifle from its place by the door. She reappeared on the porch an instant later, the rifle butt pressed awkwardly against her shoulder, the long barrel shaking in her hands as she leveled it at the four men. "Get off my land," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was low, guttural, and absolutely steady. The effect was instantaneous. Sheriff Brody's eyes widened in panic, his hand hovering near his pistol. Jed's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Even Silas Kane looked momentarily taken aback. A tense, heart-stopping silence descended. The only sound was the wind and the frantic beating of Alara's own heart. Then Silas Kane threw back his head and laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed in the valley. "Well, well," he sneered, his composure regained. "The kitten has claws after all. It won't save you, girl." He wheeled his horse around. 48 hours? He called over his shoulder as they rode away. But the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer a victim to be pitied or bullied. She had declared war. Chayton found her an hour later, still on the porch, the heavy rifle clutched in her white-knuckled hands. He looked from her face, set like flint, to the desecrated grave and then back to the rifle. He gave a single, solemn nod. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting had begun. Her real training started the next day. It was a brutal, relentless education in the art of survival. Chayton was a patient but demanding teacher. He took the rifle from her and showed her how to hold it properly, how to nestle the stock against her shoulder to absorb the powerful kick, how to align the sights until the target was clear. "Do not pull," he instructed, his voice calm and even. "Pulling moves the barrel. You breathe out, and at the bottom of the breath, you squeeze. The shot should be a surprise to you." He set up targets. Pine cones on a distant stump, a small white rock on a ledge across the creek. Her first shots were wild, the recoil knocking her off balance, the loud crack of the gun making her flinch. But she persisted. Driven by the image of Jed spitting on Daniel's grave, fueled by the terror of losing Lily, she fired again and again. Slowly, her shots grew steadier. The pine cones began to splinter. The white rock chipped. The training went beyond the rifle. He taught her to think like a hunter. To move not through a landscape, but with it. He showed her how to use the terrain for cover, how to melt into the shadows of a ravine. How to walk silently on dry leaves. He taught her to be patient, to watch, to wait for the perfect moment. He even taught her basic hand-to-hand combat. Not with strength, but with leverage and speed. How to use an attacker's momentum against them. Days turned into weeks of grueling practice. Alara's body changed. The soft girl from Pennsylvania disappeared, replaced by a woman with lean, hard muscles in her arms and shoulders. There were new calluses on her hands, not from digging a grave, but from the stock of her rifle. Her eyes, once wide with fear, were now constantly scanning, assessing, aware of every rustle in the trees, every shadow that moved. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had been reforged. It was no longer a paralyzing poison, it was a sharpening stone. The test came on a moonless night. Silas, enraged by her defiance and likely impatient, sent his men to finish the job. He didn't want the land anymore. He wanted her gone. He sent Jed, Pike, and 2 other thugs to burn the cabin to the ground. But they were not hunting a frightened widow. They were walking into a hunter's territory. Chayton, whose senses were as sharp as any predator's, heard the careless snap of a twig a quarter mile away. "They are coming," he said simply. There was no panic, only a grim readiness. They didn't wait in the cabin. They set up an ambush, melting into the rocks and trees that overlooked the path. Alara's heart pounded a violent rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady on her rifle. The thugs approached, carrying torches and cans of oil, their voices low and ugly. They were shadows moving against the starlight. As they reached the clearing in front of the cabin, Chayton drew his bow. An arrow flew, silent and deadly, and one of the men crumpled to the ground without a sound. Chaos erupted. Jed and Pike opened fire on the dark, empty cabin, bullets ripping through the thin log walls. Alara raised her rifle, the metal cold against her cheek. She found Jed in her sights, his large form illuminated by the torchlight. Breathe out. Squeeze. The rifle roared, the kick slamming into her shoulder. Jed screamed, a high, piercing sound of pain and surprise, and dropped his torch, clutching a blossoming stain on his shoulder. The balance of the fight shattered. Pike, seeing Jed go down, and their fourth man fleeing into the darkness, fired one last wild shot before dragging his wounded comrade back into the woods. The silence that descended was absolute. Alara was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline a sickening, metallic taste in her mouth. She had shot a man. The thought was horrifying. But beneath the horror was a grim, exhilarating pulse of victory. She had done it. She had defended her home. Chayton emerged from the shadows, his face unreadable in the dark. He looked at her, then at the rifle, and then back at her. In his eyes, there was a new light, a deep, profound respect. She was not just a person to be protected anymore. She was a fellow warrior. The shared violence and victory forged a new, unbreakable bond between them. The unspoken feelings that had been growing in the quiet moments of teaching and shared meals now rose to the surface, undeniable and powerful. That night, Chayton led her back to the hidden spring. The full moon was high in the sky, casting a silver, ethereal light over the hollow, making the water glitter like liquid diamonds. The air was still and cold and felt charged with a sacred energy. He turned to face her, his expression serious, his dark eyes searching hers. "In my culture," he began, his voice low and resonant, "we do not have a man of your book or a paper from a court to bind two people. A bond is made between two spirits, witnessed by the Creator, by the land, and by the ancestors." He took a step closer. "To take a woman as my wife is to pledge my life to protect her and her children. It is to make her spirit a part of my own. Her fight becomes my fight. Her heart becomes my heart." He paused, his gaze intense. "Your old world is gone. Its laws have failed you. My world has kept you alive. I ask you, Alara Vance, will your spirit join with mine?" Tears welled in Alara's eyes. He was right. Her world of rules and civility had abandoned her to die. This man, with his quiet strength and his ancient ways, had not only saved her life, but had shown her how to claim it for herself. He saw her not as a helpless widow, but as a fighter, an equal. "Yeah," she whispered, the word a release, a promise, a prayer. He knelt by the spring and dipped his fingers in the cool, wet clay of its banks. Gently, he took her wrist and drew a simple, elegant circle on her skin. Then he offered her his own wrist. With trembling fingers, she did the same for him. He then took a small knife and cut a single, thin lock of his long black hair. With deft fingers, he braided it into a strand of her own brown hair, physically weaving their lives together. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch warm and steady. "Before this sacred water, under the eye of the moon, I call you Asachi, my sacred wife." He then looked towards the cabin, where Lily slept peacefully. "And I take your daughter as my own." It was not a passionate kiss of romance novels. It was a gentle, reverent touching of foreheads, a sharing of breath, an acknowledgement of two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. They were no longer a desperate woman and a reclusive hunter. They were a family, bound not by law or tradition, but by a sacred vow made in the heart of the wilderness. Silas Kane was a man unaccustomed to failure. The news that his men had been routed, one dead, another wounded by the widow herself, sent him into a black rage. Her defiance was no longer a mere annoyance. It was a personal insult, a challenge to his absolute authority. He stormed into the Redemption Gap saloon, the batwing doors flying open with a crash. His arm was in a sling, a stark, humiliating symbol of his miscalculation. The room fell silent. He strode to the bar, unrolled a freshly printed poster, and slammed it down. "There's a new price on an old problem," he announced, his voice ringing with venom. It was a wanted poster, but not for Alara. It was for a nameless Indian renegade, with a crude but recognizable sketch of Chayton. $500, Silas roared, silencing the murmurs. "This savage has been hiding out in the valley, a danger to all our families. He's filled that poor, grieving widow's head with poison, turned her against the law. He's the reason for all this trouble. I want him, dead or alive. $500 in gold." The air in the saloon crackled. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a man a new life. In that moment, Silas Kane turned every desperate rancher, every greedy bounty hunter, and every frightened townsman for 100 miles into an enemy. He couldn't get to Alara directly anymore, so he had put a price on her heart. The war was no longer just for her homestead. It was for Chayton's life. Weeks passed. They were prisoners in their own valley. Every shadow could be a threat, every distant sound a potential hunter. Their supplies, never plentiful, began to run dangerously low again. Then Lily fell ill. A fever, hot and persistent, left her listless and weak. Alara recognized the signs of lung fever, and she knew the herbs Chayton could find wouldn't be enough. She needed real medicine, laudanum, from a general store. The risk was immense, but there was no choice. They decided on the town of Dusty Creek, a smaller, more remote settlement 30 miles south, hoping it was outside Kane's immediate sphere of influence. Alara disguised herself, tucking her hair under a drab bonnet and wearing an old, oversized coat. Chayton would wait with the horses on the edge of town, hidden. Dusty Creek was even more desolate than Redemption Gap. Alara entered the general store, her heart pounding. The owner was a woman named Martha, with a face like a weathered map and sharp, intelligent eyes. Alara bought the medicine, her hands shaking as she counted out the precious coins. But their caution wasn't enough. A grizzled man sipping whiskey at a table in the corner, a bounty hunter with opportunistic eyes, had seen Chayton waiting. He'd seen the wanted poster. As Alara stepped out of the store, the man was already talking to the local sheriff. "That's them. The woman and the Indian." The sheriff, a young man eager to make a name for himself, drew his gun. "Hold it right there." The world exploded into chaos. The street erupted in gunfire. Chayton, seeing the trap spring, urged his horse forward, firing his own pistol to give Alara cover. She dove behind a water trough, drawing Daniel's pistol, her mind shockingly clear. All the training, all the practice took over. They fought back to back, a whirlwind of desperate, deadly motion. They were no longer a separate man and woman. They were a single, fighting unit, their movements anticipated, their actions coordinated. Alara fired, providing cover while Chayton spurred his horse closer. He swept her up onto the saddle behind him, and they galloped out of town in a hail of bullets, leaving chaos and confusion in their wake. They escaped, but not unscathed. As they cleared the last of the buildings, Alara felt Chayton flinch. Looking down, she saw a dark stain spreading across the buckskin on his side. He'd been hit. Chayton led them to a place of last resort, a network of hidden caves tucked into the base of a sheer rock face, the entrance concealed by a thick waterfall of ancient ivy. It was a place his people had used for generations as a refuge. Inside, the air was cool and damp. He slid from the horse, collapsing against the cave wall, his face pale. The bullet was lodged deep in his side. The roles were now completely reversed. Alara was the protector, the caregiver. With a calm she didn't feel, she tore strips from her petticoat to staunch the bleeding. She cleaned the wound as he instructed, using a poultice of chewed herbs he identified for her. For days she nursed him, her world shrinking to the confines of that dark, damp cave. She barely slept, watching him fight off the fever, listening to his ragged breaths, terrified that the heart of her new world was about to be ripped away. On the third day, their water supply ran low. Chayton, weak but lucid, directed her towards a deeper part of the cave system where, he said, a small underground stream flowed. Taking a flickering lantern, Alara ventured into the oppressive darkness. The passage was narrow, the rock walls slick with moisture. As she held the lantern up to check her footing, its light caught a strange, unnatural glint in the wall. It wasn't the sparkle of mica or quartz. It was a dull, heavy gleam. Curious, she set the lantern down and pried at the spot with the tip of her hunting knife. A chunk of rock came away, and beneath it was a thick, unmistakable vein of dark, heavy ore. Silver. Her breath caught in her throat. She followed the vein with the lantern light. It was thick, wider than her hand, and it ran deep into the rock, heading in the exact direction of her homestead. In that instant, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It was never about the water. It was never just about a strategic plot of land. It was about this immense hidden wealth. Daniel must have found it. He must have told someone. Or Kane's spies must have overheard him. He hadn't been killed by random claim jumpers. He had been executed. Silas Kane had murdered her husband to steal a secret fortune. She stumbled back to Chayton's side, a piece of the heavy, dark ore clutched in her hand. The fight was no longer just about survival or even revenge. It was about justice. It was about taking back not just a piece of land, but the truth of her husband's death. Chayton was too weak to fight, and they were out of options. They couldn't run forever. They needed help. "There is a man," Chayton whispered, his voice hoarse. "Samuel. He lives high in the peaks, a prospector. My father called him a friend." He coughed, a racking sound. "He is not trusting, but he hates Kane." Leaving Chayton with water and food, Alara made the perilous climb into the high mountains. She found Samuel's hovel, a ramshackle hut clinging to the mountainside like a stubborn limpet. Samuel himself was as weathered and wild as the terrain, with a long, tangled beard and eyes that glittered with a half-mad paranoia. He greeted her with the barrel of a shotgun. "Get off my mountain!" he screeched. "Chayton sent me," Alara said, standing her ground. "He said you hate Silas Kane." The name was a magic word. The shotgun lowered a few inches. "Kane is a snake who swallows the sun," Samuel spat. "What's it to you?" Alara didn't waste words. She opened her hand and showed him the piece of silver ore. Samuel's paranoid eyes widened, the madness replaced by a prospector's avarice and awe. He snatched the ore, bit it, weighed it in his palm. "Where?" he breathed. Alara told him everything. The murder, the forged deed, the poisoned well, the bounty. As he listened, a slow, grim understanding dawned on his face. He'd had his own run-ins with Kane, had been cheated out of a claim years ago. Her fight was his fight. "You want to kill a snake like Kane? You don't just cut off its tail," Samuel cackled, a rusty, unhinged sound. "You gotta go for the head. You gotta blow up the whole damn nest." He led her to a small, hidden dugout. Inside were several crates. He opened one, revealing dozens of waxy, paper-wrapped sticks. Dynamite. "Kane took my claim," Samuel said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Let's see how he likes it when we take his town." The cave became a war room. The flickering lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls as the unlikely trio planned their assault. Alara, her face grim with purpose. Chayton, recovering, his mind sharp as ever. And Samuel, a grizzled old ghost animated by a thirst for vengeance. They couldn't win a straight fight. Kane had the numbers, the guns, the law in his pocket. So they wouldn't fight his way. They would fight their way. They would use fear, chaos, and the element of surprise. They would turn the town of Redemption Gap, Kane's fortress, into a trap for its king. The plan, devised by Chayton's strategic mind and fueled by Samuel's intimate knowledge of explosives, was daring and precise. First, the diversion. Samuel would use a portion of his dynamite to create a massive explosion at Kane's warehouse on the eastern edge of town. The warehouse was filled with grain and mining supplies. It would create a spectacular blaze. The fire would be the bait, drawing Sheriff Brody and the bulk of Kane's hired guns out of the town center. Second, the infiltration. Under the cover of the ensuing chaos, Alara and Chayton would slip into the heart of town. Their target, the Grand Saloon, Kane's opulent headquarters. It was where he held court, where he kept his safe, his forged documents, his power. Third, the confrontation. They would corner Kane, seize the evidence of his crimes, the real mine survey maps, the forged deed, and use it to expose him, not to the corrupt sheriff, but to the townsfolk themselves. They would break not just his body, but his power, the illusion of respectability he'd so carefully constructed. It was a desperate gamble. If any part of it failed, they would be caught and killed. But as she looked from Chayton's steady gaze to Samuel's manic grin, Alara felt no fear, only a cold, clear certainty. This was the end of the road. One way or another, it would all be over by sunrise. Night fell on Redemption Gap like a shroud. The wind was high, moaning through the alleys, a perfect accomplice. On a hill overlooking the town, Samuel cackled as he laid the charges against the foundation of Kane's warehouse. He lit the long fuse with a flourish, the spark a tiny, defiant star in the darkness. "Happy reckoning, Silas?" he muttered, before scrambling for cover. The explosion was immense. A thunderous roar ripped through the night, followed by a whoosh as the warehouse erupted in a column of fire that painted the clouds orange and red. Shouts of panic echoed from the town. Just as they'd planned, Sheriff Brody, followed by a posse of a dozen of Kane's men, galloped furiously towards the blaze. The trap was sprung. While all eyes were on the fire, two shadows detached themselves from the darkness on the other side of town. Chayton and Alara moved with the wind, silent and swift. They flowed through the back alleys, a perfectly synchronized unit, their years of hunting in the wilderness now applied to a jungle of wood and stone. The Grand Saloon was still lit, but mostly empty, save for a few nervous patrons and Kane's inner circle of guards, including the wiry, dangerous Pike. They slipped in through a back entrance, Chayton leading the way. The fight was sudden and brutal. Chayton moved like a phantom. Before the first guard could even shout a warning, a thrown knife found its mark. Chayton's bow sang twice, two arrows thudding into the chests of men reaching for their guns. Alara, her pistol now an extension of her arm, moved to his flank. The chaotic, open-field battles were one thing. This was close, ugly work. Pike lunged at her, a long knife flashing. She didn't retreat. She sidestepped, using his momentum to throw him off balance, and brought the barrel of her pistol down hard on his wrist. He howled, the knife clattering to the floor. She didn't kill him. She didn't need to. She had broken him. They stormed up the grand staircase to Kane's private office. He was there, behind his massive oak desk, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He was trapped. "You!" he snarled, his hand inching toward a drawer. "Don't!" Alara said, her voice dangerously calm. She leveled her pistol at his heart. Chayton flanked the door, his bow ready. But Kane was a cornered rat. He was faster than she expected. He didn't go for a gun. He snatched up a small, pearl-handled derringer he kept as a paperweight and pressed it to his own temple. "You think you've won?" he spat, his eyes wild. "This town is mine. They'll believe what I tell them. You're nothing but a killer and a savage's whore." "No," Alara said, her voice cutting through his tirade. She took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "I am Alara Vance. This is Chayton, my husband, and you murdered my Daniel for what is in that safe." She nodded towards the large iron safe in the corner. The standoff was broken by the sound of running feet. The remaining patrons and a few curious townsfolk, including Martha from the general store, crowded at the bottom of the stairs, drawn by the sounds of the fight. At that moment, Sheriff Brody, his face smudged with soot, burst back into the saloon. He saw the scene. Kane with a gun to his own head, Alara and Chayton armed and resolute. For a tense second, he was frozen, his loyalty being pulled in two directions. This was Alara's moment. She reached into her pouch and threw the heavy piece of silver ore onto the desk. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. "He killed my husband for this," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity and power, carrying down to the crowd below. "There's a river of it under my land. The deed he holds is a forgery. The proof is in that safe." Every eye went from the silver to Kane to the safe. Sheriff Brody looked at the angry, determined face of the woman who had survived everything he and Kane had thrown at her. He looked at the hard, silent threat of the Choctaw warrior beside her. And he looked at the faces of the townsfolk, their fear of Cain beginning to curdle into suspicion. He saw the tide turning. He saw his own survival. Slowly, deliberately, Sheriff Brody drew his own pistol. But he didn't point it at Alara. He pointed it at his boss. "Silas Cain," Brody said, his voice shaking but loud enough for all to hear. "You're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Vance." The fight went out of Silas Cain's eyes. The derringer clattered from his limp hand onto the desk. The illusion was shattered. His reign of fear was over. The sun rose on a town transformed. Silas Cain, the untouchable king, sat in his own jail cell, a broken man. The contents of his safe, the true survey map showing the silver vein, the clumsily forged deed, and ledgers detailing his criminal enterprises, had been laid bare for all to see. Alara and Chayton walked out of the sheriff's office into the morning light. The townsfolk who had once shunned them now watched with a mixture of fear, awe, and profound respect. Martha, the store owner, stood on the boardwalk, and as Alara passed, she gave a short, sharp nod, a rare smile touching her weathered lips. It was a sign of acceptance of a community beginning to heal. Samuel, already smelling a fortune, was talking excitedly with the town council about forming a proper mining company, promising Alara the controlling interest. She hadn't just won her land, she had inadvertently liberated a town. Months later, the valley was at peace. The Vance homestead was no longer a symbol of loss, but of resilience. The cabin had been repaired and expanded, a new room added for a growing lily. A sturdy new fence circled a thriving garden, and a new clean well had been dug near the porch. Alara sat in a rocking chair on that porch, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. She was no longer a girl. She was a woman, forged in the fires of grief and violence. Her hair, long and rich, was often tied back in the Choctaw style Chayton had taught her. At her feet, Lily, now a healthy, babbling toddler, played with a carved wooden bird. Chayton came and sat beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was filled with a deep, abiding understanding. They were a family, whole and strong. The wealth from the silver mine ensured their future, but it was the strength of their bond, a bond of love and respect, that ensured their happiness. The camera of the mind pulls back. It shows the three of them, the woman from the east, the warrior from a displaced nation, and the child born of both hope and sorrow. They are a new kind of American family, looking out over the vast, beautiful, and finally peaceful valley that was and always would be theirs. They were home.